For the sake of this story, I'll call myself Evan. About a year ago, I moved to Boulder, Colorado for work. I didn't know anyone in the area. Most of my time was spent working from home and going on runs around the neighborhood, alone. After a couple of months, I realized I needed to get out more. Working from home all the time gets lonely, so I joined a local hiking meetup group. The group usually met on Saturday mornings near Chautauqua Park. Sometimes there were only 5 or 6 people. Other times there were 20. The first time I went, everyone seemed pretty normal. People introduced themselves, talked about gear and trails, things like that. One of the guys there was named Trevor. He looked like someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. Early 30s maybe. Tall, thin, always wearing a dark green jacket. He came up and introduced himself pretty quickly after I arrived. He asked if it was my first time with the group. I said yeah. He told me he had been hiking with them for a couple of years. At the time, it just seemed like a normal conversation. Nothing about it stood out. Over the next few weeks, I went on a few more hikes. Trevor was there most of the time. He tended to walk near me on the trails. I figured that was just because we had started talking the first day. But he asked a lot of questions. Where I moved from, what I did for work, and how long I planned to stay in Boulder. Looking back, Trevor asked more questions than most people, and he remembered details. About a month in, something started to feel a little off. One morning, I went for a run along Boulder Creek Path. About halfway through, I passed someone coming the opposite direction. It was Trevor. He waved, said he had just finished a run. I didn't think anything of it. 2 days later, I was at a Whole Foods on Pearl Street. When I turned into one of the aisles, I saw Trevor again. He noticed me right away and said something about running into each other everywhere. I laughed and agreed. Boulder is a small city, right? But the third time, I was working from a coffee shop called Boxcar Coffee Roasters. About an hour after I sat down, Trevor walked in. He looked a little surprised, but then came over to say hi. He said he had just been in the neighborhood, but I remember thinking it was kind of weird that I had seen him 3 times that week. Trevor started messaging me more often, small things, asking if I was going to the hike, sending photos of trails. I started answering less. Not because I disliked him, I just didn't know him that well. One evening, I got home from the gym around 9:30. When I walked into the parking lot, I noticed a car idling near the exit, a silver Subaru. As I walked past, I thought I saw someone inside who looked like Trevor, but I couldn't be sure. It was dark. A few days later, I opened my apartment door and noticed a folded piece of paper on the floor just inside the doorway. Someone had pushed it under the door. I picked it up and unfolded it. There was only one sentence written on it. You should come on the hike this Saturday. No name, nothing else. But Trevor was the first person I thought of. I skipped the hike that weekend. I also started wondering, how did someone even know my apartment number? I had never told anyone in the group where I lived. About 10 days later, it was around 11:30 p.m. I was watching a movie in my living room when I heard a noise outside. My apartment is on the first floor facing the parking lot. I looked through the blinds. There was someone standing near the edge of the lot, facing my building. They stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then they walked away. The next morning, I noticed my driver's side mirror had been folded inward. It wasn't broken, just pushed in, like someone had touched it while walking past my window. That same afternoon, Trevor messaged me. He said he hadn't seen me around in a while. I didn't reply. I left the meetup group. I removed him from Instagram. I blocked his number. I figured if he couldn't contact me, he would eventually lose interest. For a few weeks, nothing happened. I started relaxing. Then, one morning, I opened my door to leave for work. There was another piece of paper on the floor, just like before, folded in half. I picked it up. My stomach dropped. This time it said, "You should not ignore people who care about you." No name. Same handwriting. I reported it to the manager, but the hallway cameras were offline for maintenance. There was no footage. A month later, I moved to a different apartment across town. I never told anyone from the group. I didn't update my address anywhere publicly. I haven't seen him since. No more notes. No more shadows. Still, I think about it sometimes, mostly because of one detail that still bothers me. I never told anyone in that hiking group which apartment building I lived in. Not once. Most of the time, hiking is pretty predictable. You drive up into the mountains, follow the trail for a few hours, then head back down. Nothing unusual happens. That's why the one hike I'm about to talk about still sticks in my head. It happened a couple of years ago near Snoqualmie Pass in Washington State. At the time, I was living in Seattle and hiking almost every weekend. That morning, I picked a trail called Twin Falls Trail. It's not the easiest hike, but it's popular enough that you usually see a few other people on the way up. When I arrived at the parking lot, there were maybe 5 cars already there, which meant some people had started earlier than me. That wasn't unusual. I grabbed my backpack and started up the trail. The first part of the hike goes through a forested area with a lot of switchbacks. About 10 minutes in, I passed another hiker coming down. He was moving pretty fast and didn't stop to talk. I remember noticing that he wasn't carrying a backpack, which was a little strange because most people bring water on that trail. Still, it wasn't that unusual. Some people hike light. About halfway up the trail, I stopped for a minute to drink some water. While I was standing there, I noticed something on the ground a few feet off the path. It was a backpack, just sitting there beside a tree. No one around it. At first, I assumed someone had stepped off the trail for a break and left their bag there. But I looked around and didn't see anyone. The woods were quiet. No voices, no movement, nothing. I walked a little closer. The backpack looked fairly new, dark blue, zipped closed. I didn't touch it at first. I just stood there trying to figure out where the owner might be. I waited maybe 2 minutes. Still, no one. Eventually, I figured whoever owned it had probably gone a short distance off the trail, maybe to take photos or use the bathroom. So I kept hiking. About 20 minutes later, I reached the lookout at the top of the trail. There were 4 other hikers up there, 2 couples. I stayed for a few minutes enjoying the view. Then I asked if anyone had left a backpack down the trail. All 4 of them said no. None of them had passed a backpack on the way up either. That didn't make a lot of sense, because the trail isn't very wide. If someone had walked past that spot without their backpack, people would probably notice. Still, I assumed the owner would come back for it eventually. When I started hiking down, I was curious to see if the bag was still there. It was. Same spot beside the tree. Still no one around. This time I walked closer. The bag was zipped shut, but one of the side pockets was open. Inside, I could see a water bottle. Nothing else obvious. No phone, no jacket, just the bottle. I stood there for a moment wondering what I should do. Leave it? Take it to the trailhead? Call someone? Before I decided anything, I heard footsteps coming down the trail. Another hiker appeared around the bend. Older guy, probably late 50s. He saw the backpack too. He stopped and asked if it was mine. I said no. I told him I had seen it on the way up earlier. He said he hadn't seen anyone on the trail without a bag either. We both stood there looking around the woods. Still nothing. Eventually, he said something that stuck with me. He said sometimes people stash gear and come back later, which sounded possible. So we both kept heading down the trail. When I reached the parking lot, something else felt strange. There were still only 5 cars there, the same ones from earlier. No new vehicles, no one waiting around. I drove home and didn't think about it much for the rest of the day. Just one of those odd things you see on trails sometimes. The next weekend, I went hiking again. Not the same trail, a different one nearby. But when I arrived at the parking lot, I noticed something immediately. A dark blue backpack sitting near the information board. The same one. I'm almost certain of it. Same color, same shape, same water bottle in the side pocket. I walked over to look at it. Still no one nearby. No note, nothing, just the bag. I checked the trail register board. Sometimes people leave notes there if they lose gear. There was nothing. I stayed there for a couple minutes, waiting to see if someone came for it. No one did. Eventually, another group of hikers arrived and asked if the bag belonged to anyone. Nobody claimed it. That's when I started wondering if it had been the same backpack I saw the week before, because the idea that two identical backpacks would be left alone on two different trails felt unlikely. I never figured out who it belonged to. And the strange thing is, I've gone back to Twin Falls Trail a few times since then. I've never seen that bag again. But every now and then, when I'm hiking somewhere new, I notice something sitting just off the trail, usually far enough away that you can't see it clearly. A dark blue shape near the trees. And every time I walk closer to check, it turns out to be nothing, just a rock or a shadow. Still, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there on those trails, there's a backpack sitting beside a tree, waiting for someone to notice it again. For the sake of this story, I'll call myself Alex. A few years ago, I was living in Virginia. Whenever I had a free weekend, I would drive up toward Shenandoah National Park. It has a lot of smaller trails that connect to each other, and most of them aren't very crowded. One Saturday morning, I decided to try a trail I hadn't done before. According to the map at the trailhead, it looped around the mountain and connected to another path further up. The entire hike was supposed to take about 2 hours, just a quiet walk through the woods. The first part of the hike was exactly what I expected. Wide dirt trail, trees on both sides. I passed 2 other hikers in the first 20 minutes. After that, the trail got quiet. About 40 minutes in, I reached a fork in the trail. There was a wooden sign pointing left toward the main loop, but there was also a narrow path heading off to the right. That path wasn't marked on the map. At first, I assumed it was just a game trail made by animals, but when I looked closer, it was clearly used by people. The ground was packed down. Branches had been pushed aside. Someone had definitely been walking there. Normally, I would have ignored it, but the path looked interesting. So I figured I would follow it for a few minutes and then turn around. The narrow trail climbed slightly uphill through thicker trees. After about 5 minutes, the ambient background of the main trail completely faded away. After another few minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. That's when I saw something I didn't expect. A rock opening in the side of the hill. Not a huge cave, more like a shallow stone hollow, dark inside. When I walked closer, I noticed something strange. There were small, stacked rocks near the entrance, like someone had arranged them deliberately, and the ground nearby looked disturbed. I stepped a little closer and looked inside. It was completely pitch black. Then, a sudden draft of freezing air hit my face. It was unnaturally cold. At that exact moment, a heavy feeling settled in my chest, a primal instinct telling me that I was entirely unwelcome in that clearing. The overwhelming sensation that something was watching me from the dark. I didn't wait. I turned around immediately to head back toward the main trail. That's when the panic set in. The path I had followed into the clearing was gone. From the clearing, it didn't look like a trail anymore, just a solid wall of trees and thick brush. I walked around the edge of the clearing trying to find the entrance. I picked a direction that looked familiar and started walking. About 10 minutes later, I stopped. The terrain was completely unfamiliar. I pulled out my phone to check my offline map. The GPS showed me standing in a blank area, far off any marked route. Getting lost in the mountains usually happens when people blindly keep walking. Instead of trying to find the missing path, I decided to force my way straight downhill through the thick brush, hoping to eventually intersect the main trail. It was difficult moving through the dense vegetation, but after 15 minutes of pushing through branches, I finally stumbled out onto a wide dirt path. I looked up and saw an official wooden trail marker. I had made it back. From there, the hike down was fast. I just wanted to get to my car. About 2 months later, I went back to that same park. I hiked the exact same trail, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to see if I could find that side path again. I reached the same fork in the trail. The wooden sign was still there, pointing toward the main loop. But the narrow path to the right was gone. Not covered, not overgrown, just not there. The ground where it should have started was untouched dirt and thick vegetation, like no one had walked there in decades. When I got home that evening, I pulled up a detailed topographical map of that specific grid in the park. I found the exact coordinates of that fork in the trail. I traced the direction where I had walked, where the clearing and the cave were supposed to be. According to the topographical lines, there was no hillside there. The map showed nothing but a sheer vertical cliff drop. There was no physical way a trail, a clearing, or a cave could have ever existed there. When someone goes missing in the wilderness, we usually blame the terrain, the weather, or a simple misstep. We like logical explanations. But after what I heard on a trail in Colorado a few years ago, I stopped looking for logic in the woods. Sometimes, the mountains hold secrets that are desperately trying to be heard. I spent a lot of weekends hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park. Living in Colorado, the park was only about an hour away. One trail I liked a lot was Jim Lake Trail. It's not a very long hike, but the views are great, and the trail isn't usually too crowded. One morning in late September, I drove up there early. The parking lot had maybe 4 or 5 cars when I arrived. The weather was cool, but clear. I started up the trail around 7:30 in the morning. The first part climbed steadily through large granite rocks and pine trees. After about 20 minutes, the parking lot was completely out of sight. At that point, I hadn't passed anyone yet, which was a little unusual, but not impossible. About halfway up the trail, I heard something faint. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the trees, but after a few seconds, I realized it was a radio frequency, very faint, somewhere ahead on the trail. It sounded like someone using a walkie-talkie, a broken signal followed by a voice. I couldn't make out the words, just fragmented communication. I assumed there were hikers further up using radios, maybe a search and rescue team training, or park rangers communicating. It didn't seem like anything unusual, so I kept walking. About 5 minutes later, I heard the frequency again. This time it was clearer, a voice, but the transmission was weak and heavily distorted. I slowed down and listened. The voice spoke briefly, and then the signal died out completely. At that point, I expected to see someone around the next bend in the trail. But when I turned the corner, the path was empty. No hikers, no rangers, no one. I kept walking. After another 10 minutes, I reached the viewpoint near Gem Lake. There were 2 hikers sitting on the rocks near the water. That was it. I stayed there for a few minutes and eventually asked if they had heard any radio transmissions earlier on the trail. They both said no. They had just arrived a few minutes before me, and they hadn't passed anyone else either. That didn't make much sense, because the broadcast had definitely come from somewhere ahead of me. After a while, I started hiking back down. About halfway down the mountain, the signal broke through again. This time the words were slightly clearer. It sounded like someone asking if anyone was there. Then the frequency dropped again. I stopped walking. The transmission seemed to be coming from somewhere off the trail, maybe deeper in the trees. I waited to see if it would happen again. After about 30 seconds, the voice came back, distorted, almost like a failing device trying to push a signal through. For a moment, I considered leaving the trail to look for whoever was operating the radio, but the terrain there was aggressively rocky, dropping off into dense, steep woods. It would have been incredibly easy to lose sight of the path and get completely lost. So I stayed where I was. Eventually, the signal faded entirely, just silence again. I continued down the trail and reached the parking lot about 20 minutes later. Everything seemed normal. Before leaving, I stopped at the ranger information board. I asked a park ranger if any search teams were operating in the area that day. He said no, just normal hiking traffic. I mentioned the radio transmissions on the trail. He looked a little confused, explaining that park radios operate on much stronger frequencies, and if a ranger had been nearby, I would have seen them. At the time, I assumed it had just been someone with a handheld radio hiking somewhere off the main path. About a week later, I went back to the park. This time, I stopped at the visitor center before hiking. There was a bulletin board near the entrance with recent notices. One of them caught my attention immediately. It was a missing person notice. A man had disappeared on a trail not far from Gem Lake. According to the notice, he had been missing for several days before search teams were sent out. The strange part was the detail at the bottom of the poster. It said the hiker had been carrying a two-way radio, something he carried during solo hikes in case of emergencies. The date he went missing was listed clearly on the page. It was the exact same morning I was on the mountain. I don't know if those things were connected. Maybe someone else had been using a radio somewhere nearby. Maybe the signal bounced through the mountains in a strange way. But every now and then when I think about that hike, one detail still bothers me. The voice I heard didn't sound calm. It sounded deeply disoriented, like someone desperately trying to reach anyone who might be listening. And the signal had been coming from somewhere far below the trail, deep in the thick trees. Somewhere I never walked.